Welcome again to Energy Talks, part of the Uliza Usichezwe campaign of the Kenya Civil Society platform on oil and gas. My name is Charles Wanguhu. I'm the coordinator at the platform. Today, I'm honored to be hosting Professor Patricia Kameri-Mbote, and I look forward to an interesting discussion around environment, the energy transition, and her varied career in the legal sector in Kenya. So, Professor, karibu sana on Uliza Usichezwe, our podcast. We're very happy to host you.
I am very happy to be here.
So, when I look at your background, your CV is rich, from working on the initial constitutional review, working on the initial environmental laws in Kenya, from guiding and mentoring, I guess, a huge chunk of the legal fraternity in Kenya. Just give us a bit more background on who Professor Kameri-Mbote is and her experience in the legal sector.
I'd say Patricia is a typical girl growing up in the 70s and 80s who went to law school, not because she knew what law school was going to be like, but because she performed well and found herself at the only law school in the country, which is the University of Nairobi Law School. And I went through law school. I would say my first degree in law was basically just going through law. And it was when I went to the University of Warwick, where I studied law and development, that I began to ask myself, what is law all about? Because I began to see that law is actually within a context, social, political, economic. I actually had a crisis because I began asking myself, what is this thing I studied called law? And how does it affect me as a human being and also me as a Kenyan who comes from a particular community? So I'd say that my journey then from that point has been a journey of critiquing law. So you will see my work, for instance, on women's law. Because I began to ask the question, how come the law I learned at undergraduate didn't mention women? Actually, my identity as a woman was sort of invisibilized in my study of law at the first instance. But when I went to Warwick, I began to think, but I'm a woman, so it can't be that you learn law in the same way and that law affects you in the same way as it affects everybody else. But the real crisis was when I started teaching at the University of Nairobi. And I had not been taught law by women. And I was one of the first two women who were teaching law. And even my rights as a woman were actually different from my colleagues. And from that day on, I was a champion and a champion of women's rights and critique of the status quo. So that's a brief background.
Thanks for bringing that. You said you're sort of a typical woman growing up in the 70s, but you went on, back then that was the only law school, and you went on to become the dean of the Nairobi Law School. What was that experience like, coming back from that background where even very few of your professors themselves were actually women, to now being the head of that law school?
It's a long journey because, when I remember when there were crises at the school, and the late Okoth Ogendo would call me and tell me, I want to hear from you. And I tell him, why are you looking at me? I'm only a child. So I found myself, I grew up into a chair of department. I actually vied for deanship in 2007 with a very politicized, the ethnicized, politicized tensions in the country. So that the deanship elections failed. And that was a difficult time. Actually, that's what made me leave the University of Nairobi, take unpaid leave. And I took unpaid leave in 2008 and then found myself at Strathmore in 2009, starting the new law school. So I came back. When I came back to be a professor. But my dean had just become a judge. And I knew that because of having started competition, people were looking at me and I wanted to know what I think. So I really was damned both ways. And I decided again to vie for deanship. Very divisive deanship elections. But I became dean, and I really enjoyed being dean because law school, I mean, just contributing to growing my law school was a labor of love. And then left after 2 terms.
And I think you've also initially mentioned how, in sort of framing your understanding of law, you started looking at the political, social, and economic aspects of law. And so obviously you experienced that political bit during the deanship. But I wanted to touch a bit more on the economic. And so for your postgraduate, you studied property and environmental law?
That was my doctoral work at the University of Warwick. I was actually looking at law in economic development. So I was actually looking mainly at trade laws and also intellectual property rights. So actually, even in going to do my doctorate, I wanted to do intellectual property rights and biotechnology.
Yes.
But after I had developed my theoretical framework, it was clear that there was no biotechnology happening in Kenya. And so I ended up now going to land and wildlife. But intellectual property rights showed me just how those who have money get to take from those who don't have money, and especially the produce from plants, from just what they come and take, and then they work on it, and then it's patented, and then some company has rights, and the people who originated the idea and who've looked after the resources really have no rights.
And I think that sort of also transitions us very well into the natural resource sector. And so for us at the platform, obviously, when you look at this sort of oil and gas exploration, it is happening in those areas which are already sort of marginalized, sort of have struggled to be part of the bigger development. If you call now sort of the bigger cities a bit more developed, I mean, how in your experience, what's the big challenge there in terms of how do you protect communities in those areas in terms of their livelihoods that they are currently engaging in? The like you speak about, I mean,
Biopiracy.
yeah, exactly, the biopiracy that happens, but and sort of the struggle between powerful actors. And what we see in the oil and gas sector is that you have this powerful actor who's this international oil company who's interested in what's in your ground, and it's not really bothered about protecting. I mean, they're not a protecting force; they're just sort of an exploitative force. How did that play out when you are sort of in that space of property and environmental law?
You see, you can't look at property, whether you're looking at intellectual property or land rights and natural resources, without the background of colonialism. Because colonialism was about cutting off resources, extracting and cutting them off. So I think when we talk about sustainable development, we forget that we were changing laws that had been crafted to encourage the harvesting of resources and selling them off, whether you're talking about trees or you're talking about trophies from animals. They were all to be taken and sold off. And that's why when you go to many museums around the world, you find things that were removed from our countries and they're there. So what I find us forgetting also is that we deal with renewable and non-renewable resources. So when you're talking about the cutting off of trees or trophies, you're dealing with renewable resources. Of course, there is a limit as to the carrying capacity. If you overharvest, you may not give enough time to reproduce. But with oil and gas, they are non-renewable resources. And so when they're taken, they're gone, they're gone. And for both, you're looking at how do you take care of communities that have been living on the land that has the renewable and non-renewable resources, and for the renewable ones have actually been looking after those resources. And so when people come in, and it's not just the multinational corporations. Sadly, in our country, we have different Kenyans, if you like. There is the Kenyan who has a lot more say, and then there's that other Kenyan who this Kenyan thinks needs to be patronized and shown what happens. Like when oil was discovered in Turkana, I had very heated discussions with people from Nairobi going up there, saying, that you didn't care for Turkana at all. So don't tell me you're going to Turkana to care for Turkanans. You want to be like that person coming from abroad. You pick and you just run and you don't care for the people there. And I was asking, Turkana are cattle people. So once you degrade their land through the mining activities, what is going to happen to them? Because they are cattle people.
And I think they coined the term local. Was it local content?
Local content.
So they're saying there's a local which is us, and then there's local which is us, and then there's sort of local which is now Kenyan, or what we consider as sort of the Nairobi people.
I actually was responsible for that because we worked with Senator Gideon Moy's Energy Committee.
Yes.
With Nathan Ronald Singh, working on the local content bill in 2015. And I was saying, you can say local content, and then you have people flying to Turkana, and now you can go in the morning and come back in the evening.
Yeah.
And then you say, this is local content. But the local content we're talking about is the empowerment of the local person there. And empowerment of the local person so that they feel they have a stake. And so when you're saying haki yetu, it will not be you and us and them. Yeah, so they won't be chasing Patricia away because she came from Nairobi together with people who came from London or New York.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of very insightful in terms of how people, like you're saying, there's different kinds of Kenyans, even within the space, and is that largely a developmental thing? I mean, did we just, like you said, just sort of neglect that area because we felt, I guess initially, without oil and gas resources or other natural resources, people felt, they didn't want to, they weren't venturing there before the big finds.
I teach a course on equality law.
Yeah.
And I like Wachira Mainer's description of how development neglected certain areas in Kenya. And he explains it, which I find very convincing, on the basis of where the railway line passed. So the people along the railway line were really the focus of development. So everything else, like when they called the Northern Frontier District, it's like the nether land. Yeah. So people don't even think there is life there. And I don't know whether in your time you knew that you couldn't even travel to northern Kenya because of the shifters, the raiders. And so in a sense, it's a neglected territory. And I don't know when you started going to Turkana. I went to Turkana in the early 2000s. What we were doing a policy on wildlife. And there is in Turkana, that is where they have the cradle of humankind. So just looking at what is up there. And there was absolutely no place to stay.
Yeah.
And when I have now gone back post oil, I am amazed at just what has sprung up. And my question always is it benefiting the locals or is it another extraction? And then you make hay while the sun shines. When the sun is not shining, come back and leave the people to sort of wallow back in their misery.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very interesting point because we, like some of us who've been fighting also for even the oil revenues to go to that level is around that. What's a longer term picture? What does a long term picture for that area look like during production and then post production? And it goes very. I think that just sort of it's a good segue into the next question around environmental protection during contracting for mining and petroleum projects in East Africa. Mm-hmm. I know you had this high-level webinar recently.
Yeah.
So we'd be very interested to hear some of the key findings that came out of that webinar. How do you protect the environment? This sort of, I think sometimes we get caught up in this. It's like an option. It's, you either have two options. It's either you exploit your resources or you protect the environment. How do you ensure that and ensure compliance, for example, around laws?
I think we are at this point when everybody now accepts that sustainability is a key question. And it is not something we've come to because we've become wise. It is because nature has actually shown us just how brutal it can be if we don't take care of it. So there are many safeguards. I mean, in law, from 1992, when there was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and when you had the 5 Rio conventions on climate change, on biodiversity, on desertification, and then there's the Rio Declaration, and then Agenda 21. So in all those, you see concern for the environment that had not been there. And I think that's when we now have sort of shifting of gears from extraction to we need to look after the planet. And of course, that is now after the people seeing that there had been many extinctions before of the dinosaurs and others, but the consumption of humans was just sort of getting the planet, many species extinct at rates that had not been witnessed before. So for many of our countries, we've come to those environmental agreements. And you see, I was at Rio. And so I remember developing countries' argument that the developed countries developed by destroying their habitat and their species. And now they want to stop us from doing that and to stop us from developing. And I think the international community was ingenious because that is how you have the provisions for transfer of technology to developing countries, and even the Global Environment Facility to provide funding for the countries to actually implement the mechanisms. So many of our countries now, like we have a framework.
Yeah.
And that framework, of course, like EMCA, the Environment Management and Coordination Act, was way before the Constitution, actually 10 years before the Constitution. So that vision for a sustainable environment is there. And so when people go to Turkana, even if in their hearts they don't want to look after the environment, they have to check certain boxes. And also the funding agencies, whether you're talking about the World Bank or even the EU, they come in with very stringent environmental safeguards. And I remember at a point where even when we didn't have national safeguards, those ones from the bank would actually, the operational procedures would actually come in and force our governments to play ball. I think it becomes a little complicated when you have the entry of China, because China sort of plays to where our countries would want to be. Because you see, they don't, and also what happened in the US under Trump. Because now people begin to sort of normalize not looking after the environment. And that, I think, has really cost our environment a lot.
And so, when you mention it like that, I mean, that's sort of a challenge, and especially, I guess, during the entry of China into the natural resource space. I think you mentioned a lot around the role. So what do you see the role of lawyers in sort of combating climate change, I guess, beyond, I mean, of course, the clear entry point is the development of those frameworks of stronger laws. But how does that balance out in our countries now with that push and fight between the more developed countries versus the developing countries? In the whole climate change debate, there's a push now, for example, to leave resources in the ground. There's a bigger push around energy transition. But how does that play out, and what's the role of lawyers, do you feel, in that discussion around climate change?
You know, the harvesting of resources affects habitats because you see, when you're mining or you're actually drilling oil, you're not just if it was just a place where you just get it and then you remove it and you're not destroying the habitat around, you could actually say you can mine and go. But I think we need to look at situations where balancing everything, it might be better that the resource stays on the ground. And I'm looking at, just look at the Albertine Rift.
Yeah.
And you look at its significance as an ecological landscape. And you have to ask yourself, what is the better good? I mean, is it better to remove these resources and give people money? You know, there's this assumption that oil makes people rich, which of course is fallacious. In fact, I think when you look at many places, they talk about the Dutch disease, how countries become rentier states. You look at countries like Angola, you look at many countries, poverty seems to come when you have these resources being exploited. So for the countries that discover them later, we shouldn't follow the same path that others followed. We should be able to say, yes, the resources are there, but we shouldn't remove them. We don't have to remove them. Who said that when you have resources, you must take them?
Yes, but I mean, if you look at, for example, the investment that's needed towards energy transition, don't you see that it's an opportunity to use these resources to build towards that transition?
It is an opportunity.
Yes.
It is potential.
Potential. Yes.
Whether it actually becomes a reality is another factor. And the question then is, nobody can guarantee you that once we take the oil resources from Turkana, we are going to be in Canaan. In fact, far from it. And then for those people who are living there, I have to keep saying, Turkana are cattle people.
Yes.
And the resources, a lot of the drilling, the exploitation of resources is driven by the greed of we are the ones who want to get more money. It will not necessarily go to the person in Turkana. And the transition in energy, I think there are other sustainable ways. I mean, there are other sources of energy. We have sun here for so long. Why haven't we developed the solar sector? And for me, I'm not an engineer, but I have this, my theory is that the reason they will not let a country like Kenya or countries in Africa develop solar is because the big energy companies would stop having those agreements they have when there is no water in the dams. Water is becoming scarce. So why are we still continuing using hydro? And then when hydro is not enough, we go to the oil. We actually use diesel-powered engines. So for me, I think we have wind, we have solar. Why don't we develop those?
It's yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you on that sentiment. I mean, I think it's interesting that diesel, one of the most, one of the dirtier fuels, still remains a core component of our energy mix in Kenya. And actually, our next speaker will actually be delving into that. How do you balance that energy mix? At the same time, like you say, I mean, there are companies who are invested in that. We have power purchasing agreements that ensure that those people are paid whether they're on or not. So it remains a mix there. But I wanted to go back a bit to, and I think that's what you've been discussing now, is so one of the biggest impacts in oil and gas exploration on the population is actually on the women and children. And so how do we ensure that there's inclusion of women when those discussions are on the table? So that even when you argue that actually, this is just our exploitation of these resources is driven by our greed. It's not necessarily to benefit people or to ensure that development happens. How do you ensure that that the people who are most vulnerable, most impacted by these activities are actually on the table when these discussions are happening. Yeah, I mean, how do you adapt legislation to do that?
You know, adopting legislation is the easy part.
Yes.
Implementing is the more difficult part.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in our country now, we have laws that talk about inclusion of women. Yeah. Why don't we have two-third gender rule law passed in parliament and implemented? So the women and children, if you're talking about hierarchy, yeah, you have now the powerful, and the powerful determine in what measure people will get rights. And because there have been historically fewer women in decision making, you have their voice not being on the table. And that is going to continue for a long time. Because if you look at our constitution, I mean, having participated in that constitution, you know, when we woke up in 2010, yeah, we were like, we are in a dream, you know, it's like a child in a candy store. Everything we want is here. But little did we know, yeah, that getting it implemented was going to be a Herculean task. And it's really been difficult. And you can see right now in the discussions on BBI constitutional amendment, gender is nowhere. And many times when women's rights are not protected, children's rights are not protected. Because you see, children are really dependent on the adults that look after them. And whereas those adults are men and women, because of the division of labor between men and women, looking after children is really a women's job. Yeah. But you had asked me what role lawyers can play. And you know, lawyers in this country, we are trained to be people who make money. So there is the public good, I mean, and then the private good. Yeah. And our legal profession is actually tailored for the private good. So a lawyer will have no qualms going with the big companies, even when people on the ground are suffering. The lawyer who looks after communities, after the indigent, is the exception to the rule. And this is why you have people like Okia Omtata just finding a niche, because there is no lawyer like, the people's lawyer. Yeah. We have trained our lawyers to just look at the private good. And you see, lawyers are very powerful because you see, they make laws. They are very involved in the implementation of the laws, both as the ones who represent companies and represent local communities and individuals. They are the judges, they are the prosecutors. And I think it's PLO Lumumba who once said, if you see any good or bad deal, there is a lawyer before it, behind it, at its side or above it. So you can see that if we developed a legal profession that answers to the needs of the public interest, and I'll speak about, for instance, schools like Stanford, reach out to even people like myself to mentor their law students on getting into public service, because they see that as a gap. And actually, they will resource students who want to go into the public service. They may even have their loans cancelled so as to give them the incentive. Yeah.
And so would you say that is the role of academia in addressing some of the issues that the country faces? That you need an academia that's also instilling these principles on their students, transparency and accountability, sort of environmental protection. I mean, isn't that a role for you, Mwalimu, as in terms of that next generation? How do you ensure that it's within their psyche? So it's not only, like you're saying, I mean, the legal profession has been geared towards making money, but how do you, instill sort of values? I know in the law school there's sort of a professional ethics class and that kind of thing, but it's not. Does it go far enough? I mean, how do you go further in terms of instilling some of these principles?
The academia can actually do that.
Yeah.
But there are very strong forces in society. Yeah. Like there are people who probably think, Professor Mbote joined the profession of teaching. She has signed to a poverty vow. I don't know how many times I have to tell my students I am not poor, because I can't have a top brain and be poor. But silver and gold I may not have, but who said silver and gold is the only value? But in our country now, if you look at the newspapers, you watch TV, you hear the discussions that are ongoing, it's all about shillings and cents. There's nothing about values and about posterity. So if I can benefit, it doesn't matter who gets hurt. And I think the academia is working in a very difficult situation in trying to change a narrative that is already formed. I remember once somebody telling me it's like trying to make good furniture from already rotten wood. So it doesn't matter how good your workmanship is or workwomanship, if you like. As long as the wood is not good, once you make the table, it will begin to bend. And I remember, I will not name the lawyer, but he's a prominent lawyer. And I identified him very early. And I said, looking at you, you would make an excellent teacher. And, he looked at me very sadly and said, I really respect what you do, but I am more drawn to X and Y, who, of course, were people practicing and doing many other things in the they are privately recognized lawyers. Yeah. And, I have actually called out that lawyer and said, would you still answer me in the same way today? So we have an ongoing conversation. Yeah.
So it's a longer term project. I don't want to. It sounds very pessimistic when you say rotten wood. So I want to give you a chance to sort of, with your parting shot, to give us a bit of optimism in terms of going forward. What's a reform process looking like? I think you mentioned it today a lot. The challenge between implementation, passing laws and implementing them. You mentioned sort of a whole variety of things, but that sort of stuck to me, and I felt that how do you give us some optimism going forward in terms of your parting shot?
I am actually sad that I should be the one being pessimistic, because I'm one of the biggest optimists. I wouldn't have stayed at university all these years, and I love my job because, you see, I know that we influence the next generations. When you sit in front of class, you don't just impart knowledge. People observe you. And so it would be good for the academia to sort of stay the course. There is one mentoring, having people learning at your feet. Because when you mentor people and you work closely with them, they observe what you do. And I have had students just, like the way, simplicity, because it's not always about having big cars, having big things. But the other thing is through research and being deliberate about transgenerational succession. So that if we all picked people and said, below me there is a staircase of people. If I am not here, you can call on X. Because if, the people who taught me before, they will be saying, I am the best teacher in X, north of the Limpopo and south of the Sahara. I think that's a failed academic. Because, you see, you should be able to produce many of yourself. And that's through mentoring, coaching, but also through research. The rotten wood, I think, is more the social crafting of people. When people come, you can be taught professional ethics and pass the exam. But being ethical is what you do when even nobody is watching you. It's not about being on stage and then you can say Patricia is ethical. Being ethical is about what I do when I know nobody is watching or even suspect I won't be found out. And that is a bigger societal value. I think we recognize that in this country, that is a big problem, but it is not insurmountable. I think I like Wangari Maathai's, you do your thing. If you're just even with your own beak taking a little water, and you're trying to put out a forest fire, you're doing something. If we all did something, I think we will get somewhere.
Wow. It's a very, very good parting shot. Reminds me sort of the human rights thing about ensuring that within your sphere of influence, and your sphere of influence doesn't have to be huge, and you don't have to have a huge footprint, but that sort of small within your sphere, just ensuring that rights are protected in that. Thanks a lot, Professor Patricia Kameri-Mbote.